Tier 1 led off with CeeDee Lamb. You are looking at an incredibly high floor. Back-to-back weeks with at least 18 fantasy points, and he has yet to score a touchdown. You're averaging over 100 yards per game. You're averaging about 12 targets per contest as well. And going into the future, we can assume that the Dallas Cowboys are trailing a lot of these games. We get a ton of Dak Prescott pass attempts. Now, Puka Nacua, I believe, has been the wide receiver one so far this season in points scored. And we go back to week one. The dude only ran like 22 routes because he was in and out of the game with concussion concerns. Incredibly high ceiling and floor combo. I think that you can say only Chase has a higher weekly ceiling. But now that you're not going to have Joe Burrow for a few months or possibly at all again this season, I think we do have to move Chase down this list. Once we get confirmation on the Burrow injury, Chase could fall to tier A. Now I completely understand, yes, Chase just dropped 36 points this week. I know firsthand he did it against me. But realistically, I think we can all be in agreement. You would rather have Joe Burrow as the quarterback here for the Cincinnati Bengals. So even if Chase was the 101 early, I think that it's tough to keep him there now. And then looking at what we have with Malik Neighbors, Neighbors also drops the 37 points this past week. Neighbors gives you 167 receiving yards and multiple receiving touchdowns. But I don't think we're going to get 400 passing yards from Russell Wilson every single week going into the future. So we should have some regression. But regardless, I think these are your tier 1 wide receivers until we get Burrow confirmation that if he's out for the season, then at that point, Chase would fall to tier A, right alongside Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, there's no problem being a tier A wide receiver, right? Amon-Ra St. Brown just dropped 39 fantasy points with 3 receiving touchdowns. We go back and look at all of 2024, all of 2023. I believe this is the best game that Amon-Ra St. Brown has had from a fantasy points perspective since week 2 of 2022, his second season in the NFL. Looking at the departure of Ben Johnson, really, it doesn't seem like it's impacted this Detroit Lions offense whatsoever. Really, it seems like the only thing that can impact this Lions offense is when they have to go up against the Green Bay Packers, the best defense in the league, which they're not going to have to do until week 13 again. Now, Justin Jefferson will be our next option. With Jefferson, I will say he's at least come through with double-digit points for you in the games in which McCarthy's been horrendous. McCarthy has had one good quarter, and that was the fourth quarter of the Chicago Bears game. You want to give him the benefit of the doubt, very similar to Cam Ward, right? These are his first games ever at the NFL level. But McCarthy's played a lot of high-level football in the past. So I don't necessarily know how much time he should realistically need. Nico Collins, I don't know what he does week 2 yet. I'm recording this right before that game. I will say if you wanted to go through and if you wanted to see expectations for Nico in week 2, Underdog currently has him higher, lower 77.5 total yards, higher, lower 13.05 fantasy points, which is obviously much better than what you had in week 1, where week 1 he comes through with only 5 targets, 3 receptions, and 25 receiving yards. But you go back to last season, the man last year in only 12 games, he scored 210 fantasy points. The year prior in 15 games, he scored 261. So I still think Nico Collins is an elite level receiver. But of course, if you wanted to go and check out that Underdog pick'em for Nico Collins or any of these guys that have still yet to play, you can find the link to Underdog Fantasy in the description comment section. If you use code FLOCK when you sign up, you're going to get $50 added into your account after you play your first $5, and using code FLOCK would be the number one way to support this channel. Jackson Smith-Njigba back-to-back weeks here where he just has a phenomenal target rate. Now, it does look like Cooper Kupp's involved somewhat in the second week. The issue that you're going to have with JSN will just be the touchdown upside. This will project to be one of the worst offenses in the league. And while JSN can dominate targets in the way that Malik Neighbors can, we haven't seen the same big play upside from Jackson Smith-Njigba that you do with Neighbors. And also, we don't know if Darnold can get to the 400 yards that we just had from Russell Wilson. Now, going over and looking at Drake London. London week 1, you get the 15 targets. Week 2, he falls back down to earth dramatically. Like through the first 2 weeks, you do have Drake London sitting at about 16 total fantasy points. I don't know if this has anything to do with the shoulder injury that he suffered at the end of week 1, but they had fully removed him from the injury report going into this past week. Now, again, Minnesota defense, pretty tough to go up against, and the Falcons were able to just run the ball over and over and over again. They weren't forced to pass. You should have better matchups going into the future. Now, moving over to our next tier, we are going to be looking at Ladd McConkey. With Ladd, he hasn't played tonight. We'll see what happens. I understand that Quentin Johnson and Keenan Allen were the wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 in fantasy points up until this point, but fact of the matter is we go through and we look at what you had from Ladd McConkey at the end of 2024, where he comes through and starting in week 8, he averages about 15 to 20 fantasy points per game. I think we have a large sample just showing us that Ladd McConkey, the young ascending wide receiver going into year 2, should be the number 1 option. Now, looking at our next receiver with Brian Thomas Jr., he's been the number 1 storyline in all of fantasy football week 2, and the target volume was fine. The issue with Thomas is every time that he thought he was going to get hit, he just dropped the ball. He's playing scared. You can see 1,000 different viral clips. You can see the coaching staff talking about it. It looks like a serious problem. It's a very different problem to what you had in week 1, where in week 1, you had 7 targets with only 1 reception, but that wasn't drops based. Instead, that was just Trevor Lawrence inaccuracy based. But you have a total of 19 targets so far with Brian Thomas. The hope is he's able to put these struggles behind him. You can go back to the end of last season with him being, a wide receiver that after the bye week had 18, 16, 32, 28, 23, and 17 fantasy points and finishes the wide receiver 1 with Mac Jones. So I'm going to give him 1 more week. And if we have another week like what we just had, he will get nuked down these rankings and probably drop to tier C. Now, A.J. Brown will be our next receiver. A.J. Brown also is going to get 1 more week. Now, the reason I'm willing to give A.J. Brown the benefit of the doubt here, despite him yet to crack 10 total fantasy points this season, is while a lot of wide receivers would just be happy that their team is winning football games, A.J. Brown's not about that life. A.J. Brown, if the Eagles are 15-0, yet he doesn't have the receiving yardage mark that he wants, he will be making a scene. He'll be crying on the sideline, and he's going to do everything that he can to get his targets. And for me, that's what I want in my fantasy football number 1 wide receiver. I want them to be that squeaky wheel. I want them to understand that scoring fantasy points will be more important than winning football games. And I think the Eagles are going to get forced to throw the ball to A.J. Brown soon. Devontae Adams will be our next name. Adams, this past week comes through with a big-time performance, much better than week 1. We get the 22 fantasy points and the 13 targets. So the target volume's there and quarterback play that can support 2 wide receivers. We've seen that for a long time with Stafford. Going over and looking at Tet. Tet has yet to crack 20 fantasy points, but back-to-back weeks here, averaging almost about 10 targets a game. The only real concern that you'll have is going to be the lack of touchdown upside based on the quarterback play, specifically with how bad Bryce Young's look through 2 weeks. Now, Mike Evans, we have yet to see play week 2. I know week 1, it wasn't super compelling. He only scored 10 fantasy points, but still we can go back and look at where he was at 2022, 2023, 2024. Every year as he's aged, he's actually become a more efficient wide receiver. I actually would have higher expectations for Mike Evans than where we are ranking him here for tonight's game. But again, long-term, you are eventually going to get Godwin back in this offense. Now, moving over to our next tier, we are going to have Tyreek Hill. With Tyreek, you get the massive bounce back in week 2. Looks like he's still not happy with Tua. Looks like their chemistry is still not there. But you get the under receiving yards, and the Miami Dolphins offense, they don't look good, but they look like they can at least pick up first downs, and there will be touchdowns to be scored. Marvin Harrison, super boom bust option. Week 1, we had 18 points. Week 2, we had 4. Now, I'm not just basing him being boom bust off that. We can go back to what we had in 2024. Week 1, then, he had 1 point. Week 2, 29. Then week 3, 17. Then 14. Then 5. Then 0. Then 5. Then 23. Then 3. Then 16. Then 7. Then 17. Then 8. Then 5, 7, 15, 7. There's no consistency whatsoever with Marvin Harrison. Boom bust wide receiver, target volume's not there. You really bank it on big plays. Looking at what we have with Sutton, I'm going to give Sutton the benefit of the doubt. Again, we can go back to 2024 and see that week where he just gave you absolutely nothing. Against the New Orleans Saints, week 7, he scored 0 points despite having 86% of the snaps. What did he do after that? 17, 23, 19, 14, 29, 16, 12, 10, 16, 20 fantasy points. And then he goes in week 1, has 18 fantasy points this year. Then, of course, week 2 against Indianapolis, super disappointing performance. But I think you can look at the larger sample of Sutton and understand that nothing really has changed here. Obviously, Troy Franklin looks exciting, but Sutton's still the wide receiver 1, and Bo Nix is bouncing back. McBuka, we're going to have at 19. Again, super exciting player. You're really hoping that there's a lot of passing volume in this offense. The projections for Igbuka on the game on Monday are actually pretty low. Underdog has him at higher, lower 9.95 points. But again, in the long term as well, you are going to get Chris Godwin in here. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. My fantasy football team, the wide receiver room was really hinging on T. Higgins being good. And now that we have no Joe Burrow, I am very much concerned about that. T. Higgins is my wide receiver 1 on my team. It is embarrassing to admit out loud. I am really going to need to just jam 4 running backs into my lineup every single week. We're going to go Barkley RB1, Jacobs RB2, ETN in the first flex, Pollard in the 4th flex, and then hope that freaking like T. Higgins and DK Metcalf can get us there. But I'm lowering expectations with Higgins, of course, now that we have no Joe Burrow. And then going over and looking at Deebo Samuel, we're raising our expectations with Deebo with no Austin Eckler, where if you look at the area of the football field that Deebo operates, it's not exactly the same as what we have with running backs, but obviously it's a lot closer to Eckler than what you would have with like Terry McLaurin. And we haven't had like another running back such as Jacory Crossy-Merritt really emerge as a capable receiving option in this backfield. Now, every week that goes by, Rashee Rice becomes a little bit more valuable. I want to say he was around like wide receiver 28, 29 in our rankings coming into the season. Then last week he moved up to about wide receiver 24, wide receiver 25. This week, we're going to have him wide receiver 22. Week 4, he'll probably be about wide receiver 20. Week 5, he'll probably be about wide receiver 17. Week 6, he'll probably be about wide receiver 14. And by the time we get to week 7, he'll probably be inside my top 12. He'll probably be inside my top 10. So I want to remind y'all, just because a player isn't playing doesn't mean they should be going down your rankings. It's quite the opposite. As they serve their suspension, as they get closer to returning from their injury, they become more valuable. Rome Odunze is currently shooting up our rankings, of course. 32 fantasy points this past week. He's averaging 10 targets per game over the past 2. Absolutely insane. You've had nothing from Luther Burden. You've had nothing from Loveland. Rome Odunze's clearly being the alpha wide receiver 1 over DJ Moore. We get one more performance like this, I think that we can just completely erase how bad he was as a rookie. And Rome Odunze could clearly steam himself all the way up to tier B very quickly. Like we get another 20-point performance from Rome with 10 plus targets. Rome Odunze will jump into the top 15 of my rankings quickly. Now, Zay Flowers also steaming up these as well. Flowers really like starting him in week 1. Week 2, I wasn't so certain about it just given the game environment. But hell, he had really good market share numbers. He had 11 targets in a game in which Lamar didn't throw the ball a ton. Obviously, Lamar had the passing touchdowns, but the passing attempts weren't necessarily there just because they were so damn efficient. And if Flowers scored a touchdown, you'd be looking at a wide receiver that would be like borderline top 5 so far this year. Now, with Garrett Wilson, we saw just the absolute bottom fallout of the Jets offense. We had him as that sell-high candidate last week. Yes, he's still going to dominate the market share numbers here for the Jets, but this is going to be a rush-first team that even when they are forced to throw it, we don't know if they're going to be able to actually pull it off or if the efficiency is just going to be horrendous like we saw against the Bills. Now, with Terry McLaurin, he's also been very, very bad, but the thing that we can say is with the holdout, maybe it's just caused him to start a little bit slow, similar to what we saw with Brandon Ayuk last year. Now, of course, what that led to was a significant Brandon Ayuk injury. We're not hoping that with Terry McLaurin, but it wouldn't be the most surprising thing if Terry McLaurin just gets a couple weeks of practice in, a couple of games in, and then all of a sudden, weeks 3, 4, 5, he goes back to being who he was last year. If it wasn't for the Eckler injury, I still think I'd have Terry over Deebo Samuel, but the Eckler injury makes me put Deebo ahead of him. Now, DK Metcalf is the wide receiver 2 for my own fantasy team, and it's not exciting. Through the first 2 weeks, he's had double-digit points both times, but the big plays aren't there. This past week against Seattle in the revenge game, I was very excited, thought we were going to get the volume, thought we would get a big, and we got lucky to have like the wimpiest little touchdown I've ever seen in my entire life. So Metcalf, I know that we have a strong connection. I know we're doppelgangers. I know that we are brothers from another mother, but I think you kind of got to prove your spot on my roster if you want to stay in my wide receiver 2 slot. Now, George Pickens does get the massive bump up this past week in comparison to where he was against Philly. Obviously, Pickens going to be that boom bust wide receiver operating deeper downfield and actually providing more real life value than he will for fantasy. Going over and looking at Travis Hunter played less. The thing with Hunter that's so interesting is the efficiency has been horrendous. Like, the Jacksonville Jaguars are actually better off just running the football than throwing it to Travis Hunter. 4.13 yards per target week 1, 3.67 yards per target week 2. I didn't see every single Travis Hunter target in week 2. We saw them pretty much all in week 1, and every single one was like a little bubble screen, little quick slant, just doing anything they can to manufacture him touches. I'm kind of assuming that's what happened here week 2 as well. Jamison Williams, that we had as a buy low candidate last week. Just looking at him and saying, okay, well, you know what? The expectation should be that the Detroit Lions offense bounce back in a big time way. It does happen, but obviously it just all gets funneled through Amon-Ra St. Brown. Actually kind of disappointing. I know JMO scores about 19 fantasy points, but you actually only had 4 targets. And then looking at Devonta Smith, I drafted in so many underdog best ball drafts, thinking that there was no way the Philadelphia Eagles were as run heavy this year as they were last season. But it looks like that take is just aging like a glass of milk on a sunny day. Now, Chris Godwin, very similar to Rashee Rice, much lower in my rankings 2 weeks ago than he is today. He is just slowly but surely climbing his way up into where I assume that we're probably going to be able to actually start putting him in our starting lineup in week 7, 8, and then definitely after the bye in week 10. But I mean, I wouldn't be the most surprised if Godwin ends up playing in weeks 3 or 4. But with Godwin, you're going to have to treat him as somebody that you cannot actually put in your starting lineup until you have an impressive performance. Is he probably going to be on a snap count, very similar to what we're seeing with Stephon Diggs at the moment. Chris Olave, back-to-back games with double-digit targets. Olave also, the efficiency's been horrendous, very similar to Travis Hunter. 4 yards per target week 1, 5 yards per target week 2. A lot of running backs can be more efficient than that. Ricky Pearsall is playing a career-high snap rate. And with Ricky Pearsall, you have him averaging about 12 points per game over the past 2 weeks. If we get another week in which Juwan Jennings has double-digit targets and is the number 1 wide receiver here in San Francisco, it's a real shot. We just have to flip Jennings and Pearsall in these rankings. DJ Moore falling like a rock here. There's a good shot that DJ Moore ends up being ranked like wide receiver 40 a week from now if we get another performance under 10 fantasy points, because big thing is with DJ Moore versus Rome Odunze as well, is it's not just Rome's like crushing him with fantasy points. It's also the target volume too. So I want to say that it's probably a pretty sticky thing to predict going into the future. Looking at Jacoby Myers had 10 targets week 1. Don't know what he's going to do tonight. I mean, if you were interested in going and taking a higher lower on Underdog, you can see that he is currently sitting at higher lower 59.5 receiving yards. Now, Jalen Waddle will be our next guy. Waddle was in an interesting bounce back spot this week, of course, because it was a really good matchup going up against the New England Patriots. I don't love Waddle outside of maybe if you were to get an injury to Tyreek Hill, then all of a sudden we could be a little more excited. Now, y'all know I really like drafting Xavier Worthy this year. And it actually sounds like Xavier Worthy has a shot to come back in week 3. Now, I don't want to get overly optimistic about this, because we can go back and we can look at reports before Hollywood Brown was ruled out for the year in 2024 of Andy Reid pretending like Hollywood was going to be able to come back last season. And then if we were looking at Worthy's injury specifically, what I've been hearing is he's going to have to wear a sling. He's going to be at a very high risk for re-injury. And I don't know if that's going to impact his actual output. Now, going over and looking at Calvin Ridley, he's averaged 7 targets a game over the past 2 weeks. He's yet to crack 10 fantasy points. Alec Manners looked like the wide receiver one here. I'm going to give Ridley one more week with the benefit of the doubt, assuming that he will eventually put it together. Jordan Addison's like one of the very few players that I said like, oh, you're a suspended guy, you're an injured guy, your value is going to go up as you get ready to return. Addison, I actually moved down the rankings after how bad J.J. McCarthy looked on Sunday night. So we're moving Addison down, not because he's out of sight, out of mind, but because I'm less excited about what being in this Minnesota Vikings offense means for these receivers. Keon Coleman, massive letdown here in week 2 with 5 fantasy points. if you're looking at Keon, it's just going to be a spot in which the Buffalo Bills plan A is going to be to run the ball over and over and over again. And you're just kind of hoping that you get a spike in best ball. Michael Pittman Jr. will be our next guy. Didn't like the matchup this past week against Denver, but you still had a ton of points scored by this Indianapolis Colts offense. However, Pittman only had 8 points to himself. They're really spreading the ball out a ton, and it does look like Tyler Warren may actually be the number one option. Juwan Jennings will be our next guy. Jennings was the wide receiver 1 in San Fran this past week. This is like the 5th good game of his NFL career, but hell, he's quickly looking like we should be projecting him out as the wide receiver 1. Matthew Golden, I know he was close to a big play on Thursday night, but as of right now, he scored about 5 fantasy points so far in his career. Now, you do have a significant injury to Jaden Reed, however, which looks like it may open the door for Golden. And then I have Stephon Diggs and Jerry Jeudy as the wide receivers 3 and 4 on my own fantasy team. Diggs has clearly been on a snap count, but when he's been on the field, he's been getting targeted heavily. And then Jerry Jeudy, we really just haven't seen anything from yet. Week 1, we had the drops, which were very frustrating. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is they end up benching Flacco and the passing volume goes down. Now, moving over to Khalil Shakir. I was kind of hoping that we had a better performance from Shakir week 2. I drafted him in some best ball leagues, but again, Bills just simply didn't throw the ball whatsoever. And it looks like Keon may be the wide receiver 1. Josh Downs does have 8 targets and double-digit fantasy points this past week for the Colts. But again, rush first offense, and they're spreading the ball out a ton. Now, going over to the Chargers receivers with Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston. We'll have to see what they do tonight, but obviously I'm going to be live streaming every single night, giving you updated rankings, answering fantasy football questions, so just make sure that you are subscribed. And I would recommend hitting that bell next to the subscribe button so YouTube tells you when we go live. If you wanted to see what the projections were for Keenan tonight, Underdog currently has him higher, lower, 10.25 fantasy points, which is very interesting because that's actually higher than what they have for Egbuka. But if you wanted to check out any of those pick'ems, you can find the link in the description comment section. Code FLOCK will get you set up with a $50 bonus after you play your first $5, and it will be the number one way that you can support this stream. Underdog is available in almost every state. But I really appreciate you. Really hope I was able to help you out with this video, and I really hope I get to see you out in the live stream after the games tonight.